The Galathor Xenolinguistics Institute floated in geosynchronous orbit above Primaxis 7, a monument to academic pretension that somehow managed to look down its nose at everyone despite being a building. Its crystalline spires refracted the light of 3 nearby suns, creating rainbow patterns that the architects insisted were cosmically significant but really just gave everyone headaches during morning lectures. For the past 800 standard years, this institution had been the galaxy's premier destination for studying dead languages, which was exactly the kind of niche prestige that made everyone involved feel simultaneously important and deeply aware that they'd chosen a career path that made them insufferable at dinner parties. The Institute's halls were populated by the sort of beings who could spend 6 hours debating the correct pronunciation of a word from a language whose last native speaker had died during the third expansion, and then do it again the next day with renewed enthusiasm. These were scholars who had dedicated their lives to decoding scripts found on crumbling tablets, corroded data chips, and occasionally, as a treat, at the inside of ancient spaceship hulls, where someone had apparently decided that eternity was the perfect time to workshop their poetry. Professor Krell'tho of Vaxen Prime represented everything the Institute stood for, which was to say he was brilliant, insufferable, and possessed the kind of ego that required its own gravitational field. His 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern across his elongated skull, could simultaneously read 4 different texts while maintaining an expression of profound superiority. His tenure at the Institute had been marked by several breakthrough translations, 2 academic feuds that had resulted in the creation of entirely new scholarly journals just so the warring parties wouldn't have to publish in the same one, and a legendary incident involving a misinterpreted glyph that had briefly convinced half the galaxy that an ancient civilization had worshipped sentient cheese. He had never quite lived that one down, but he'd published enough papers since then to bury it under layers of legitimate scholarship. Mostly, the Xenolinguistics department occupied the Institute's western tower, where the morning light was perfectly calibrated to illuminate ancient texts without causing photodegradation, because of course it was. The main lecture hall was a circular chamber with holographic projectors embedded in every surface, capable of displaying 3-dimensional reconstructions of linguistic artifacts in exquisite detail. The seats rose in concentric circles around the central presentation area, designed so that every student had an optimal view and nobody could slouch in the back without being noticed. It was in this temple to the decoding of dead words that Professor Krell'tho had assembled his most advanced graduate seminar, a collection of 20 beings representing 14 different species, each one supposedly the brightest linguistic mind their world had produced in a generation. They were, without exception, exactly as humble about this distinction as you would expect. The prize students included Vornquick, a Zeloxian whose 7 tentacles could simultaneously manipulate holographic interfaces, while 3 of his 9 vocal chambers lectured anyone within earshot about his publication record. There was Jeteka, a crystalline Threxian whose body resonated with harmonic frequencies that she insisted gave her unique insights into the musical properties of language, and who had never encountered a theory she couldn't make about herself. Rounding out the group's unofficial triumvirate of insufferability was Blorp, a methane-breathing Gorfian who attended lectures via a sealed environmental suit and whose translated communications always seemed to include phrases like, "as I theorized in my paper," and which confirms my earlier hypothesis. And then there was Marcus Webb. Marcus was human, which was his first problem. Humanity had joined the Galactic community a mere 75 years ago, which in cosmic terms made them the equivalent of the new neighbors who just moved in and were still figuring out which day was trash collection day. Humans had proven themselves surprisingly adept at certain things: improvisation, creative problem solving, an unsettling talent for making weapons out of whatever happened to be nearby, and an absolute refusal to read instruction manuals. What they had not proven was any particular aptitude for the kind of meticulous, theoretical linguistic analysis that institutions like Galathor prided themselves on. Marcus had somehow talked his way into the graduate program through a combination of genuine talent, stubbornness, and what his application reviewers had charitably called an interesting perspective on cross-species communication patterns. What they'd meant was that his entrance essay had been refreshingly free of the kind of academic posturing that made everyone else's submissions read like they were auditioning for the role of most likely to correct someone at a party. He was a tall human, at least by the standards of his species, with the kind of perpetually rumpled appearance that suggested he had never quite figured out what business casual meant and had decided that clean enough was an acceptable standard. His hair existed in a state that could generously be called deliberately messy, or more accurately described as forgotten about. He carried a battered physical notebook everywhere, actual paper bound in synthetic leather, which his classmates found either charmingly retro or embarrassingly primitive depending on their mood and how recently Marcus had outperformed them on an exam. The other students had initially assumed Marcus would wash out within the first semester. Humans, after all, only spoke a few dozen languages among themselves, which the galaxy's linguistic scholars found adorably quaint. Most species spoke hundreds of languages across their worlds before even achieving spaceflight. The fact that humans had dominated their planet while speaking such a limited variety of tongues was considered either a statistical anomaly or evidence that humans had gotten very, very good at hitting things that disagreed with them. But Marcus had survived his first year, then his second, consistently performing just well enough to remain in the program while never quite excelling enough to draw serious attention. He occupied a comfortable middle ground in the class rankings, which was exactly where he preferred to be. The top students attracted scrutiny and competition. The bottom students attracted pity and remedial assignments. The middle was where you could learn without becoming a target. On this particular morning, as the three sons of the Primaxis system painted the lecture hall in shades of amber and rose, Professor Krell'tho stood at the center of the chamber with the kind of dramatic bearing that suggested he'd been practicing his entrance in the mirror. His four eyes gleamed with barely contained excitement, and his manipulator appendages gestured with theatrical precision as he addressed his assembled students. "Today," he announced, his voice carrying the resonant quality that came from having three separate vocal chambers, "we embark upon what may well prove to be the defining linguistic challenge of our careers." Several students perked up, their various sensory organs focusing intently on their professor. Even the ones who found Krell'tho insufferable had to admit that when he got excited about something, it was usually worth paying attention to. Usually. 3 months ago, Krell'tho continued, warming to his subject, a salvage team working in the Tertius sector discovered a derelict station, one that had been drifting through space for an estimated 75 to 80 standard years. The station's origins remain unclear, but what we found inside has baffled every linguistic expert who has examined it. With a flourish that was entirely unnecessary but entirely expected, Krell'tho activated the chamber's central holographic projector. The air above the presentation platform shimmered and coalesced into a three-dimensional image of several rolled documents, their material composition somewhere between paper and synthetic fabric. They were yellowed with age, marked with stains that the analysis had identified as various organic compounds, and covered in dense script. "These scrolls," Krell'tho said, his voice dropping to a register that suggested religious significance, "represent an entirely unknown writing system. The script bears no resemblance to any cataloged language in the Galactic database. The complexity of the symbol structure suggests a highly advanced civilization, yet the material composition indicates a relatively primitive production method. The contradiction alone makes these artifacts extraordinary." Marcus, sitting in his usual seat 3 rows from the center aisle, felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach as the holographic image rotated slowly in the air. Something about those scrolls looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place why. He leaned forward slightly, squinting at the projected text. "Initial analysis," Krell'tho continued, clearly enjoying having everyone's attention, "suggests the script utilizes a combination of phonetic and logographic elements, with what appears to be a complex system of ligatures connecting individual symbols. The writing flows in irregular lines with variable spacing, possibly indicating emphasis or emotional content embedded in the physical structure of the text itself." Vornquick raised 3 of his 7 tentacles, a gesture that among Xeloxians indicated he was about to say something he believed was profound. Professor, could this be an example of Krell'tho psionically encoded language? The irregular spacing might indicate that the text was meant to be read telepathically as well as visually. An intriguing hypothesis, Krell'tho acknowledged with one of his eyes while the other three continued scanning his notes. However, our psionic analysis revealed no residual mental impressions beyond what we would expect from normal handling. The irregularity appears to be purely physical. J-Teka resonated at a frequency that her translator rendered as thoughtful humming. The material composition you mentioned, Professor. You said it was primitive, yet the complexity of the script suggests advancement. Could we be looking at a civilization in transition? Perhaps a society that had developed sophisticated cognitive frameworks but had not yet mastered advanced manufacturing. Possible, Krell'tho said, though his tone suggested he had his own theories and was waiting for someone to prompt him to share them. What makes these scrolls particularly fascinating is their context. They were found in what appeared to be personal quarters, stored in a sealed container alongside what our xenoarchaeology colleagues have identified as nutritional supplements, personal hygiene items, and several primitive data storage devices that were too degraded to recover. Marcus felt the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach intensify into something approaching dread. Personal quarters, sealed container, nutritional supplements, and hygiene items. He looked at the scrolls again, focusing on the script itself rather than the dramatic way it was being presented. Oh no. Oh no no no. The prevailing theory, Krell'tho was saying, is that these scrolls represent some form of religious or philosophical text, given their preservation alongside personal effects. The individual who possessed them clearly valued them highly. Your assignment for the next 4 weeks is to work in teams to analyze these texts and propose a translation framework. The class erupted into excited chatter, various species making the sounds they made when presented with an intellectual challenge that would let them show off. Vornquick was already gesticulating at 2 other students, clearly forming his team and probably already composing the abstract for the paper he planned to publish. J-Teka had begun resonating at multiple frequencies simultaneously, which meant she was either very excited or very gassy, and her species biology made those 2 states regrettably similar. Marcus said nothing. He was too busy staring at the holographic projection, his eyes tracing the swooping curves and sharp angles of the script, his mind racing through memories of 3 years ago. The semester break when he'd taken that budget transport to visit a friend on Kepler Station. The pirate attack that had come out of nowhere, forcing the transport to abandon half its cargo and execute an emergency jump. The bag he'd lost in the chaos, the one that had contained most of his clothes, some books, and his journal, his personal journal, where he'd been writing in cursive because his handwriting professor back on Earth had insisted that good penmanship was a lost art and Marcus had taken that as a personal challenge. His journal where he'd developed his own shorthand for common phrases because writing everything out was tedious. His journal where he'd documented the most mundane, embarrassing, personal aspects of his daily life because that's what journals were for. Mr. Webb. Marcus jerked his attention back to the present, realizing that Professor Krell'tho was looking at him with all 4 eyes, which was the Vaxonian equivalent of a spotlight. Yes, Professor? You seem distracted. I trust this assignment is not beyond your capabilities. Several students turned to look at him, and Marcus could practically feel Vornquick's smugness radiating across the lecture hall. The Xeloxian had never quite forgiven Marcus for scoring higher on their xenomorphemic structures exam last semester. No, Professor, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. I was just examining the script structure. And what are your initial observations? Krell'tho asked, in the tone of a professor who was definitely setting up a teaching moment and expected Marcus to provide the setup for his brilliant explanation. Marcus looked at the holographic scrolls again, at the script that he now recognized with absolute certainty as his own handwriting, and felt a very human desire to fake his own death and assume a new identity on a remote mining colony. It's very complex, he managed, which was possibly the most useless observation in the history of linguistic analysis, but was all his panicking brain could produce. Indeed, Krell'tho said, clearly disappointed that Marcus hadn't provided a more interesting wrong answer to correct. Complex and, I believe, indicative of a truly sophisticated culture. Very well. Everyone partner up and begin your preliminary analysis. I want initial hypotheses by the end of the week. The class dissolved into activity, students forming groups and pulling up their own holographic interfaces to examine the scrolls in detail. Marcus remained in his seat, watching the disaster unfold with the horrified fascination of someone watching a planetary collision in slow motion. Vornquick had assembled a team of 4 and was already running the script through a harmonic analysis algorithm, clearly hoping to find mathematical patterns that would reveal some deep cosmic significance. Galathor was examining the material composition of the scrolls themselves, running spectral analyses that she claimed would reveal the emotional state of the writer based on mineral content. Blorp was doing something with chemical signatures that Marcus couldn't follow and wasn't sure he wanted to. And all of them, every single one of them, was analyzing his grocery lists and complaints about his roommate, like they were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Marcus pulled up his own interface with trembling hands, more to appear busy than because he needed to examine the text. He knew what it said, he'd written it. He remembered writing it, sitting in his cramped cabin on that transport ship, documenting his thoughts about the cafeteria food and whether he should message that cute Relathian from his ethics class, and how his roommate kept leaving the atmospheric recycler on the wrong setting. He watched as Vornquick's team highlighted a section of text and began constructing elaborate theories about its meaning. The section in question, Marcus knew without needing to check, was his attempt to work out the calorie content of space station pizza versus Earth pizza and whether the artificial gravity made a difference in digestion. They were treating it like it was the Rosetta Stone. Over the next hour, Marcus watched his classmates construct increasingly elaborate theories about his diary entries. Vornquick declared that one passage contained mathematical proofs encoded in the symbol structure. That passage was Marcus trying to calculate if he had enough credits to buy both textbooks and beer, and concluding that beer was technically an academic resource because it helped him think. Galathor found what she called harmonic resonance patterns in another section that suggested the text was meant to be sung. That section was Marcus copying down song lyrics because he'd had them stuck in his head, and writing them down sometimes helped. Blorp identified chemical signatures in the material that he claimed indicated the writer had been in a heightened emotional state, possibly preparing for ritual combat. Marcus remembered that day perfectly. He'd spilled coffee on the journal, and then written an angry paragraph about how space station coffee was a crime against humanity. The theories grew more elaborate as the lecture period continued. Someone suggested the text might be a star chart, written in abstract symbolism. Someone else proposed it was a philosophical treatise on the nature of consciousness. A third student, who Marcus had previously considered one of the more reasonable members of the class, suggested it might be an encoded message meant only for members of a secret society. None of them, not a single one, suggested that it might be exactly what it looked like, one person's random thoughts written down in their own messy handwriting. Marcus tried to focus on his own analysis, or at least pretend to, but his mind was racing. He needed to figure out what to do. Option 1. Say nothing and let his classmates waste weeks analyzing his diary. Option 2. Admit the truth immediately and become the person who somehow managed to make the galaxy's premier linguistic scholars look like idiots. Neither option seemed particularly appealing. He was saved from having to make an immediate decision by Professor Krell'tho calling the class back to attention. Excellent preliminary work, everyone. I can see we have a range of fascinating hypotheses developing. Remember, the goal is not simply to translate the text, but to understand the culture that produced it. What can these scrolls tell us about the beings who wrote them? What was important to them? How did they view their universe? Marcus had to physically bite his tongue to keep from saying they really hated their roommate and thought the cafeteria's attempt at pasta was a war crime. Mr. Webb, you've been unusually quiet. What direction is your analysis taking? All eyes turned to Marcus again, and he felt the weight of 24 different types of visual organs focusing on him. He cleared his throat, buying time, his mind racing. "I'm taking a contextual approach," he said slowly, which was technically true. "Examining where the scrolls were found, what they were stored with, trying to understand the daily life of the person who wrote them." "Sensible," Krell'tho said, nodding with what might have been approval. "Though I caution against assuming these are personal documents. The sophistication of the script suggests something more significant." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The sophistication of the script. His handwriting, which his roommate had once described as what happens when spiders learn cursive and then have a seizure. The rest of the lecture period passed in a blur of agony, as Marcus watched his classmates dig themselves deeper into their analysis. By the time Krell'tho dismissed them, there were at least 7 different competing theories about what civilization had produced the scrolls, ranging from an unknown precursor race to a pocket-dimension civilization that operated under different physical laws. Nobody had suggested a college student with bad handwriting and too much time on a transport ship. Marcus gathered his things slowly, hoping to slip out unnoticed, but Vornquick intercepted him at the door, 3 tentacles blocking his path, while the other 4 manipulated a holographic display. "Webb," the Xeloxian said, his translator rendering his voice with the kind of smugness that transcended species barriers. "I noticed you seemed overwhelmed by the assignment. If you need assistance, my team would be willing to let you observe our methodology." "That's very generous," Marcus said, trying to edge around him, "but I prefer to work alone." "Suit yourself," Vornquick said, though his posture suggested he thought Marcus was making a mistake. "Though I should mention that I've already identified what I believe to be numerical sequences in the text. I'm planning to publish a preliminary paper on it by the end of the month." Marcus looked at the holographic display Vornquick was showing him. The numerical sequences were dates. Marcus's own dating system, where he'd been counting down to semester break. "That's great," Marcus managed. "Very impressive." He escaped before Vornquick and could elaborate further, practically fleeing down the corridor toward the student housing section. His mind was churning with possibilities, none of them good. He could still come clean, admit the truth before anyone invested too much time in this. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how that would look. He'd been in the program for 2 years. Everyone already thought humans were barely qualified to be here. If he admitted that the galaxy's linguistic experts couldn't recognize English when they saw it, couldn't decode what was essentially one human's terrible handwriting, it would be humiliating. Not just for him, but for every human scholar trying to make it in the galactic academic community. On the other hand, if he said nothing and someone else figured it out, he'd look like he'd been deliberately making fools of everyone. Which, to be fair, he would have been. He reached his quarters, a small but functional space that he shared with a Dravaxian named Kletch, who was mercifully out at his own classes. Marcus threw himself onto his bunk and stared at the ceiling, which was decorated with a holographic display he'd set to show Earth's night sky because he was apparently that kind of homesick cliché. His communicator chimed with incoming messages. His team requests, probably. Everyone would expect him to pair up with someone for the project. He ignored them all and instead pulled out his physical notebook, the one his classmates found so charmingly primitive and opened to a blank page. Then he stopped, pen hovering over the paper, as a terrible thought occurred to him. His handwriting hadn't changed much in 3 years. If anyone saw him writing right now, they might notice the similarities to the ancient script they were all studying. He put the pen down and pulled up a holographic keyboard instead, typing out his thoughts in standard galactic script. The irony was not lost on him. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus watched his classmates disappear down rabbit holes of increasingly elaborate analysis. Vornquick published his paper on the numerical sequences, which got picked up by a minor academic journal and earned him enough citations that he became utterly unbearable about it. Jeteka had begun composing what she called harmonic translations of passages, performing them in the student commons to confused audiences. Blorp had teamed up with a xenoarchaeology student and produced a 40-page report on the chemical composition of the scrolls, concluding that they'd been handled by a being with a calcium-based skeletal structure who consumed carbon-based proteins and exhaled carbon dioxide, which, Marcus noted with grim amusement, described about 40% of known species in the galaxy, including humans. Professor Krell'tho was delighted with everyone's progress. He'd begun dropping hints that he was preparing his own paper, one that would synthesize all his students' research into a comprehensive analysis of what he was now calling the tertius texts. He spoke of it in the reverent tones, usually reserved for holy relics or paradigm-shifting discoveries. Marcus, meanwhile, had been doing his own analysis, though not of the scrolls. He'd been studying his classmates' methodologies, watching how they approached the text, and slowly coming to a realization that was somehow even more uncomfortable than the original situation. They weren't actually wrong, not completely. Their analytical frameworks were sound, their reasoning was logical, their methodologies were cutting edge. The only problem was that they were applying all of this sophisticated analysis to a text that didn't need it. It was like using a fusion reactor to power a light bulb. Technically impressive, absolutely effective, and completely missing the point. The problem wasn't that his classmates were bad linguists. The problem was that they were excellent linguists who had never encountered something genuinely simple. They were so primed to find complexity that they were creating it where none existed. Marcus spent several sleepless nights wrestling with what to do about this revelation. It felt important somehow, bigger than just the immediate embarrassment. But he couldn't figure out how to articulate it without admitting what the scrolls actually were. The crisis came in the fourth week, during what was supposed to be preliminary presentations of everyone's findings. Krell'tho had assembled the class and invited several colleagues from other departments, turning what should have been a casual progress report into a full academic presentation. The lecture hall was packed with professors, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting scholars, all eager to hear about the mysterious tertius texts. Marcus sat in his usual seat, watching the disaster unfold with the helpless inevitability of watching a meteor approach a planet. He'd tried to prepare himself for this, tried to come up with a plan, but every scenario he'd imagined ended with humiliation for either himself or everyone else. Vornquick went first, presenting his analysis of the mathematical structures with the kind of confidence that only came from being completely wrong while surrounded by people who agreed with you. He'd created elaborate visualizations of the number sequences, finding patterns that he claimed revealed a sophisticated understanding of geometric principles. The patterns, Marcus knew, were his countdown to semester break repeated in different formats, because he'd been really bored on that transport ship. The audience murmured appreciatively. Someone asked a question about whether the patterns might correspond to astronomical observations. Vornquick admitted he hadn't considered that angle, but thought it was brilliant and would definitely explore it further. Zeteka went next, performing one of her harmonic translations, which involved her resonating at frequencies that she claimed matched the emotional content of the text. It sounded like someone running a crystal glass around the rim of another crystal glass, while both glasses were having an existential crisis. The audience seemed impressed. Several scholars were taking notes. One asked whether similar harmonic structures appeared in other sections of the text. Then it was Blorp's turn, presenting his chemical and contextual analysis. He'd created a full xenoanthropological profile of the culture that had produced the scrolls, complete with dietary habits, environmental preferences, and social structures, all extrapolated from the material composition of the paper and the few personal items found with the scrolls. It was, Marcus had to admit, actually pretty impressive work. It was also describing a civilization that was, in fact, just one human eating too much pizza and complaining about climate control. The presentation went on. More students shared their findings, each one building on the other's work, creating a comprehensive picture of a sophisticated civilization that had never existed. Finally, Professor Krell'tho took the stage himself. Based on the excellent work of our students, he announced, I believe we can now construct a preliminary profile of the civilization that produced the tertius texts. He activated a holographic display that synthesized everyone's research into what looked like an academic poster on steroids. Complex charts, annotated images of the scrolls, timelines, astronomical charts, and enough scholarly jargon to choke a small star system. We are looking at, Krell'tho declared, a spacefaring culture that had achieved a remarkable synthesis of mathematical, philosophical, and artistic achievement. The texts themselves appear to be personal journals of a scholar or priest, possibly someone in a position of significant cultural importance. The integration of numerical sequences, emotional resonance markers, and symbolic imagery suggests a civilization that viewed the universe holistically, refusing to separate the rational from the emotional. Marcus felt his face burning. This was it. The moment of truth. He could either stay silent and let this continue, or he could speak up and admit what the scrolls actually were. His hand moved before his brain fully processed the decision, raising into the air in the universal gesture of, I have something to say, and you're not going to like it. Krell'tho paused mid-sentence, all four eyes focusing on Marcus. Mr. Webb? You have a question? Not exactly a question, Professor, Marcus said, his voice somehow steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. More of an observation. The room's attention shifted to him. He felt dozens of eyes, compound and otherwise, focusing on him with the intensity of scientific curiosity mixed with the hope that someone was about to make a fool of themselves. Marcus stood up, his notebook clutched in one hand, and made his way down to the presentation area. His legs felt like they were made of gel that had achieved sentience and immediately regretted it, but he kept moving. The scrolls you've been analyzing, he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet room. I need to ask you something, Professor. The station where they were found. You said it had been drifting for 75 to 80 years. Correct, Krell'tho said, his tone suggesting he was waiting for Marcus to make whatever point he was stumbling toward. And the personal effects found with the scrolls. You mentioned nutritional supplements and hygiene items. Do you happen to have a detailed inventory? Krell'tho looked puzzled but pulled up a data file. Compressed nutritional bars, several containers of what appears to be dental cleaning compound, synthetic fabric items consistent with clothing, and several primitive data storage devices that we couldn't recover data from. Marcus felt his stomach sink even further. What kind of clothing? I fail to see how this is relevant, please, Professor. What kind of clothing? Krell'tho sighed but consulted his notes. The xenoarchaeology report describes them as basic utilitarian garments. One jacket-like item, two pants-like items undergarments, and something that appears to be a sleeping garment with text printed on it. What did the text say? Mr. Webb, I really must insist, what did the text say? The room had gone completely silent. Even the scholars who had been whispering to each other had stopped, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't know what. Krell'tho, looking annoyed but willing to humor his student, pulled up an image file. The garment bore text in an unknown script, which we assumed was related to the scrolls. It reads. He paused, activating his translation matrix. The translation matrix suggests phonetic sounds approximately rendering as I paused my game to be here. Someone in the audience laughed, then quickly stifled it. Marcus closed his eyes. Of course that stupid sleep shirt had survived, of course it had. Professor, he said quietly, those aren't unknown scripts. Both of them. The scrolls and the shirt, they're not unknown at all. Mr. Webb, I assure you, we have compared these documents against every language in the Galactic database. Did you compare them against human languages? The room went very, very quiet. Krell'tho's four eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of confusion in Vaxonians. Human languages, Mr. Webb. While I appreciate human ambition, I hardly think, Professor, those scrolls. They're written in English. In cursive English, specifically. With personal shorthand abbreviations. Marcus took a deep breath. They're written in English because I wrote them. That's my diary you've all been analyzing for the past month. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs right before a supernova, heavy with potential energy, that was about to be released in spectacular fashion. That's... Krell'tho started again. That's impossible. The complexity of the script is what happens when someone writes in cursive with bad handwriting, Marcus interrupted. The irregular spacing is because I was writing in a moving transport ship. The harmonic patterns are because I sometimes doodled in the margins when I was bored, and those numerical sequences. I was counting down days until semester break. Vorn Quick had gone completely still, all 7 tentacles frozen in mid-gesture. Zhoteka had stopped resonating entirely, which for her species was the equivalent of shocked silence. The transport ship that was attacked by pirates 3 years ago. Marcus continued, feeling like he was watching himself from outside his body. The one in the Tertius sector. I was on that ship. I lost a bag in the emergency evacuation. That bag contained my journal, some clothes, and yes, that stupid sleep shirt my roommate gave me as a joke. He pulled out his physical notebook and held it up. This is what my current journal looks like. Same handwriting, same language, same person who apparently can't write in a straight line to save his life. One of the visiting scholars, a Priloxian whose universal translator rendered her voice as British and deeply amused, spoke up. Young man, are you seriously telling us that the galaxy's linguistic experts have spent a month analyzing your diary? Yes, ma'am, Marcus said. And I am so sorry. The room erupted. Half the audience started talking at once, voices rising in disbelief, outrage, amusement, or in Professor Krell'tho's case, all 3 simultaneously. Vorn Quick was gesticulating wildly, his tentacles spelling out what Marcus's translator helpfully rendered as several very creative insults. Zhoteka had begun resonating at a frequency that her translator refused to process, probably because it was mostly profanity. Professor, Krell'tho held up his manipulator appendages for silence. When he finally got it, he fixed all 4 eyes on Marcus with an expression that suggested he was calculating how to murder someone in a way that would be ruled an academic disagreement rather than actual homicide. Mr. Webb, he said with careful precision, are you absolutely certain about this claim? Yes, Professor. Can you prove it? Oh. Marcus walked to the holographic display, showing the scrolls. He pointed to a section that Vorn Quick had spent 2 weeks analyzing. This part right here. It says, note to self, stop eating station pizza. It tastes like the concept of regret, gained physical form, and learned to cook. Several scholars in the audience started laughing, though they tried to hide it. Marcus pointed to another section, one that Zhoteka had performed in her harmonic translation. This part is song lyrics. Specifically, it's the chorus from Don't Stop Believing by Journey, which I had stuck in my head for 3 days straight, and writing it down was supposed to help. It didn't. More laughter, less restrained now. He pointed to the numerical sequences that Vorn Quick had published a paper about. These are dates. Countdown to semester break. See? 47 days, 46 days, 45 days. I was really excited about semester break that year. But the complexity. Krell'tho started. It's cursive, Marcus said. Human cursive handwriting. We connect our letters in flowing patterns instead of writing them separately. It probably looks complicated if you're not familiar with it. Especially when it's my cursive, which my teachers always said looked like a spider fell in an inkwell and tried to escape. Plus I developed shorthand for common phrases because writing everything out is tedious. He pulled up a section on his personal datapad and started reading directly from the scrolls, translating them into Galactic standard on the fly. Day 47. Cafeteria. Attempted something they claim is Earth-style spaghetti. It was not. I don't know what it was, but it definitely involved crimes against pasta. Also, roommate still leaves the atmospheric recycler on the wrong setting. Have left 3 notes. He claims he doesn't see them. His species has compound eyes. He has literally hundreds of individual lenses. How does he not see the notes? The laughter was open now, rolling through the audience in waves. Scholars were holding their sides, manipulator appendages, or other appropriate appendages, depending on species. The Priloxian scholar, who had spoken earlier, was